What I want to do in this video is spend a little bit more time talking about the experience of the Russian Empire during the First World War. This, of course, is very important because this informs the political, social, and economic conditions that existed at the end of the First World War, for Russia at least, with the 1917 revolutions. And it gives us some indication of how the revolution was influenced, almost exclusively influenced, by the First World War. So let's do an overview then. Let's do an overview of the First World War from the perspective of the Russian Empire. Now, fundamentally, the First World War begins because a Serb nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinates the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, which then leads to basically a series of dominoes falling that involves the entirety of the European continent embroiled in war. Essentially, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was going to declare war on Serbia. Now, this would have brought the Russian Empire into the war because Nicholas II believed that he saw himself as the sort of protector of Slavs in Eastern Europe and believed that the Serbs needed support, and so he declares war on Austro-Hungarian Empire. That brings those two countries into the war. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire is allied with the German Empire, that brings Germany into the war against Russia and Serbia. And because Germany is brought into the war, and because France is allied with the Russian Empire, that brings France into the war on the side of the Russian side. So you can see how these dominoes are starting to fall. The ways in which we, Great Britain, entered the war is because we issued an ultimatum to the German Empire to ensure that they would not violate Belgian neutrality. Belgium remained neutral, and essentially we were going to act as the guarantor for that neutrality and say, look, if you violate Belgian neutrality, we're going to have to join the war on the side of the French and the Russians. And one of the plans that the German Empire essentially incorporated into trying to take over the French was something known as the Schlieffen Plan, which was to basically go through Belgium and attack France from a more northerly position, which of course would have violated Belgian neutrality. And so that's how we got brought into the war. America gets into the war in 1917 as well, but that's basically the overview of how one single event lights a match which sets a series of events into motion that eventually leads to the entire European continent embroiled in war. There's some other contextual aspects, the idea that there were sort of global competition and there were alliance systems that were beginning to take shape prior to the war, but that's basically your TLDR on the beginning of the First World War. So now let's just zoom in from the Russian perspective, the perspective of the Russian Empire. In the initial phase, 1914 to 1915, we see that there is definitely patriotic beginnings when it comes to Russians' entry in World War I. They enter the war in August 1914, initially supported by quite a lot of patriotic fervour and mass mobilisation. This would quickly unravel under the weight of staggering losses, because within the first 5 months of the First World War for the Russian Empire, approximately 390,000 Russian soldiers were killed and nearly 1 million of them had been injured. This is an incredibly disastrous statistic. One example of this took place in August 1914 at the Battle of Tannenberg. This was a disastrous defeat where Russian forces lost as many as 30,000 troops and suffered as many as 100,000 captured due to tactical burdens. So there were poor coordination between commanders, decoded radio transmissions, all these different kinds of things. And so fundamentally, it begins not very well, let's just say, but there are some temporary successes in the 1914 to 1915 time period. So, for example, while the Russian Empire pushed back a number of Austro-Hungarian forces in the Galicia region, the German-led Gorlice-Tarono offensive of 1915 forced a massive withdrawal. This was a massive withdrawal that became known as the Great Retreat from Poland, Galicia, Lithuania, and Courland. It also resulted in as many as 1 million casualties for the Russian Empire, 1 million dead or wounded. 1916 then was facing also quite a lot of major political and social and militarily difficult situations. You have logistical failures and economic strain. There was, at this point, chronic shortages of rifles, shells, and uniforms. This was something that would plague the Russian Empire for the majority of this entire experience. At one point, as many as 800,000 soldiers lacked proper rifles, and factories produced only 13,000 rounds per day. That sounds like a lot, but it really isn't when you think about the First World War, how many people are involved in the First World War. You need to be producing a lot more than that to keep up with the kinds of industrial production of the other powers. Cities then started to face acute food and fuel shortages. Places like Moscow and St. Petersburg were receiving only 1/3 of their needs, and this is made worse by the fact that inflation continues and strikes begin to continue as well. And then another major issue takes place in late 1915, so just slightly before this 1916 period, which is where Tsar Nicholas II himself personally relieved his commander and took personal command of the army. Now, this had a number of major domestic, political, and military implications. So, firstly, the move left domestic governance in the hands of the wife of Nicholas II and the wife, as well as the circles of people like Rasputin, who, of course, would undermine the authority of his wife because of lots of rumors that his wife had been having an affair with people like Rasputin, and that Rasputin was a wizard or some kind of mystical man of quite nefarious circumstances. This ultimately leads to his assassination in 1916, but this ultimately undermines the authority of domestic governance, but it also amplifies the incompetence of the Tsar because he isn't a military commander. He's not somebody who is able to command a military, definitely not as good as his actual commanders would have been. We then start to see in June 1916 another major offensive known as the Brusilov Offensive. Under General Brusilov, the Russian army executed one of its most successful campaigns of the war. So we do get some successes. It combined an innovative infiltration of tactics as well as pinpoint attacks to break the Austro-Hungarian lines. But even though this was a victory, it was a costly victory because the army was depleted and became too depleted to be able to bring back to make good on its gains. And ultimately, the cumulative casualties by 1916 meant that Russia had suffered nearly 5 million casualties, either 5 million either killed, wounded, or captured. The result then is the revolutions, the revolutions and the exit from the war. In 1917, we get in March 1917 or February 1917, we get the February Revolution. I'll explain the difference between why it's February according to some and March according to others. It's basically just to do with the calendar that you use. It's often called the Gregorian calendar versus other calendars. It makes it a little bit confusing. Just stick to February, call it the February Revolution because that's what everybody calls it. We then get the establishment of the provisional government after the February Revolution, and one of the things that's very important to remember is that during this time period, there is still the continuation of the Russian Empire in the war. So the new government, the provisional government, tried to continue Russia's participation in the war effort. This led to what is known as the June Offensive or the Kerensky Offensive, which ended again disastrously, revealing the disintegration of the army, and it paves the way for showing just how poor the provisional government was and shows just how quickly the Bolsheviks will be able to rise in terms of their authority. The October Revolution, of course, brings the Bolsheviks into power, and they quickly negotiate peace. By March 1918, we have the peace treaty between Germany and the Russian Empire, the former Russian Empire, which is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded a great amount of territories to different parts of the Central Powers, including Ukraine, Finland, the Baltics, parts of Poland. We'll do a whole lesson on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I believe, in the future anyway. We'll get to that later on, but fundamentally we can see that there's a broad impact that all of this has on not only the Russian Empire itself, but also the entire war effort of the Allied powers of the Triple Entente. Unlike the static trench warfare of the Western Front, the Eastern Front was actually quite vast. It was quite a fluid front, and it was quite a tumultuous front. There was quite a lot of action and events taking place. You sort of get on the Western Front during the First World War a sense of stalemate because of the sort of trench warfare that you see. That is sort of endemic of the Western Front, less so of the Eastern Front. But ultimately, the military defeats and the economic collapse erodes the trust in autocracy, and it contributes directly to the February Revolution. We'll get to and we'll think about the Russian economy in World War I, as well as the social state of Russia in World War I in the next two lessons. And then from there, from lesson 5 onwards, we're going to start thinking about the February Revolution. We'll talk about its causes. We'll talk about the course of the February Revolution. We'll talk about the implications of the Tsar's abdication. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about the internal workings and the dynamics of the provisional government, the Petrograd Soviet, the nature of dual power, the ideological return of people like Lenin, and the ways in which this leads to the October Revolution and the consolidation of Bolshevik power.